Thank you for joining us for today's installment of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies Fall Seminar Series, which is co-sponsored today by the Department of English at Simon Fraser University. My name is Dimitris Kralis, and I'm the director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies and a professor of Byzantine history at the Department of Humanities. Each year, we invite scholars engaging with different aspects of Hellenic studies, broadly conceived, to present their work in our seminar series on a wide range of topics, including archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek history, as well as literary and cultural studies. As we prepare to begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event was organized at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, even if it's taking place in a digital space. SFU, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Slaytooth, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. Before I introduce today's guest, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I invite you to visit SFU's IT services website. Today's event will be formatted a little differently from our regular seminars. We will begin with a shorter than usual 15 to 20 minutes presentation by our guest speaker, and then proceed to an interview style format to be followed by a Q&A with the audience. We may end up being flexible depending on how questions come in and the interest being generated by them. Feel free to post any questions you might have in the Q&A box during the course of the event, and we will try our best to address them all afterwards. Now, it is my very great pleasure to introduce today's guest, Dr. AnnaLinden Weller. Dr. Weller is a policy advisor for the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, where she works on climate change mitigation, energy grid modernization, and resiliency planning. She's trained as a city planner, but also as a historian of the Byzantine Empire in medieval Armenia, holding a doctorate from Rutgers University. Under the pen name Arkady Martin, she writes science fiction and cultural criticism, focusing on border politics, climate change, risk communication, and the functions of narrative and rhetoric in social movements. Her debut novel, A Memory Called Empire, won the 2020 Hugo Award for Best Novel and is, in a way, the inspiration for today's event. Her articles have appeared in Uncanny Magazine, Tor.com, Bookish, and the New York's magazine The Cut. She also reviews fiction for NPR Books. Dr. Weller grew up in New York City, and after some time in Turkey, Canada, Sweden, and Baltimore, lives now in New Mexico with her wife. So, without further ado, please give a warm welcome, virtual welcome, to Dr. AnnaLinden Weller, aka Arkady Martin. To you.
Thanks so much, Dimitris, and thanks so much again for inviting me to do this. I've been excited about it all year and am terribly disappointed that we are all virtual, but needs must. And also, thank you for thinking of me for this seminar series, considering that I am no longer really a traditional Byzantinist, though I was one for many years and loved being one. So as that biography stated, I received my PhD in Byzantine history from Rutgers University in 2014, and then moved to Canada and then Sweden to continue my academic work on Byzantium and medieval Armenia. And for various reasons, in 2016, 2017, ended up swapping careers. Part of that was the sudden science fiction success, and part of that was the 2016 election in America. And I ended up working on energy policy, city planning, and climate change, which is what I do now. Though I do continue to write about Byzantium, some academic, some non. And I'm absolutely delighted to talk to you all about my work and my book, which I was very honored to receive the Hugo Award this year for Best Novel. So, A Memory Called Empire. This book is in a lot of ways the fictional version of what I worked on as a postdoc at Uppsala University in Sweden from 2015 to 2017. And my research there was about the contacts between Byzantium and the Eastern frontier, particularly Armenia, during the 11th century, and how those contacts were remembered, represented, and narrativized by the people who lived through them. And the project as a whole was very much about borderlands as trauma spaces, about history and memory as narrative repairs to a wounded sense of the world. And a memory called Empire came out of that project, and a lot of previous research into the history of imperialism, particularly Byzantine imperialism, and its methods and its horrors and its seductions. The very short version of how Byzantine history informed this book is as follows. And I think I've told this before, but here's the spiel. In the year 1044 AD, the Byzantine Empire annexed the small Armenian kingdom of Ani. The empire was able to do this for a lot of reasons, political, historical, military, but the precipitating incident involved the Catholicos of the Armenian Apostolic Church, a man named Petros Ketadar, who was determined to prevent the forced conversion of the Armenians to the Byzantine form of Christianity. And he did this by engaging in negotiation with the Byzantine emperor at the time, Constantine Monomachos, Constantine IX. And he essentially exchanged the quote-unquote key to the city of Ani, so the physical sovereignty of the kingdom of Ani, for promises of spiritual sovereignty. And when I started writing a memory called Empire, the inciting question I asked myself, because I'd been obsessed with this story as an academic, was, what's it like to be that guy? To betray your culture's freedom in order to save your culture? And I wouldn't have known how to ask that question or explore its answers without being a Byzantinist. A memory called Empire is full of all of the ideas I was obsessed with for most of my 20s, which is during my PhD and my postdoc. And those range from things as simple as, like, it's not simple, how does an empire impose narrative? How do people that narrative is being imposed on reuse and reshape it? I wrote my dissertation at Rutgers University on the letters of Byzantine diplomats stationed on the frontier, letters from one diplomat to another, and how they used the forms of letter writing, which are highly defined in the Middle Byzantine period and highly codified in Middle Byzantine culture, to reinforce and make real again the narrative of Byzantium as the center of the world, the ecumenical, all-eternal empire. And when we look at other historical records that mention these same diplomats, not their letters to each other, but where they appear elsewise, we find evidence that they are doing very syncretic, very embedded realpolitik on the ground. They react to local conditions. They're very good at reacting to local conditions. They make alliances with non-Christians, non-Byzantines, they're politicians. But that experience of reacting to local conditions on the ground is clearly existentially threatening to their sense of how the world works. So there's this overlayer in their letters of an attempt to preserve their own imperial narrative, to say that nothing has changed, to reinforce their own sense of self-identity and culture. And I was deeply fascinated by that, so I wrote my dissertation about it. And then I did this postdoc at Uppsala University in Sweden, which worked on historiography in the same period and place. So not letters, but accounts of events in various historiographies. And I also wrote most of this novel during that postdoc. While I was thinking about questions like, how do historiographies of the same event represent different attempts to control the narrative? And I wrote the novel because I wanted to explore that more emotionally and directly than I could in an academic work. I always felt very emotional and direct about it, but you have to take emotionality and some directness out of professional academic writing. But history is the trade secret of science fiction. And that is a quote from Patrick Nielsen Hayden, who is the chief editor at Tor Books, who published my novel. And I have a tendency to write science fiction when I'm not trying to write something else. It's my natural mode of expression for narrative. And I particularly love space opera. I have since I was a very small child. What I find exciting and beloved is the Star Wars universe and Frank Herbert's Dune, these enormous, sprawling, visually lush, politically rich, space-based universes that are the heart of space opera as a genre. And it's the opera as much as the space that interests me. narrative which is high intensity, high drama, vivid emotionally, vivid conceptually. And far future science fiction is my favorite place to interrogate the large philosophical and ethical questions that I run into as an academic, now as an energy policy advisor, in my daily life, to investigate those questions from sideways angles. I mean, at heart, A Memory Called Empire is concerned with what happens to people who live under conditions of cultural imperialism, and how best can a civilization honor and maintain the memory of its ancestors. And these are really large questions, but in writing far future science fiction about them, I look at them from a place where the cultural imperialism is created in part by wormhole travel mechanics, and in part by the standard imperialist practice of devaluing local cultural production and labeling it barbarian, where the memory maintenance is done by actual transmission of the minds of ancestors, or by cloning, or by intense emulation of model people from epic poetry. And I note that is not really a far future thing. I stole that straight out of middle period Byzantium. So sideways angles to examine intense question by. Now, the plot structure of A Memory Called Empire is actually heavily inspired by classic spy novels. I read a lot of Jean le Carré. What I adored about his work, and I'll still do, is the intense internality of a protagonist who is engaged in spycraft. How they have to think about what they're doing from multiple mutually contradictory angles all the time. Le Carré and the political thriller or the spycraft novel is certainly one of my work's intellectual ancestors, and also the aforementioned Dune. But if this book has a true antecedent outside of Byzantium, it's C.J. Cherryh's Foreigner series, which I highly recommend to everyone who's listening. Cherryh's Foreigner books are about a diplomat embedded in an alien culture dealing with assimilatory and existential pressures in a time of political crisis. Cherryh's diplomat is named Bren Cameron, and Bren is a pretty direct ancestor of my main character, Mahit Dzmare, except Bren's aliens are actually alien, and Mahit's aliens just think she's an alien, which is a very Byzantine problem, or a non-Byzantine in Byzantium problem. And I want to talk a little bit now about literary criticism and its examinations of science fiction and Byzantium in reference to this. So the study of classical reception in modern speculative fiction, by which I mean science fiction and fantasy, is a very old and very broad field, and has roots in both the academy and the popular press. However, much as classics is often reluctant to look beyond the temporal borders of the antique world and venture into its medieval Greek imperial successor, the consideration of classical reception in speculative fiction has mostly neglected the significant impact of Byzantium and its literature. Recent overviews, both academic, like Classical Traditions in Science Fiction, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2015, and popular, a very in-depth article at the speculative fiction magazine Strange Horizons by Professor Liz Goyne, detailing the history of classical reception. They really don't venture much beyond pointing out the underpinnings of classical mythology in speculative fiction, and occasionally they consider the use of Rome or Roman settings, which tend to reoccur, especially in science fiction. But they have not, as of yet, really explored or engaged with post-Romanness and its presence there. And this presence is actually quite visible. And what do I mean by post-Romanness in this context? Perhaps we can think of it as a concern with decline, with the problems of an empire which may be going over into decay. Post-Romanness in speculative fiction is an interjection of a long past into the history of the future, a past which has become decadent, problematized, difficult, and yet persists as an animating force. A concern, in fact, with quite Byzantine conceptions of imperial identity, specifically the problem of defining barbarian and citizen, the permeability of frontiers, the creation of an imperial ideology, and the survival and promulgation of that ideology. And these concerns have had deep effects on the development of science fiction and fantasy in the 20th and 21st centuries. In a sense, science fiction and fantasy in the Anglophone tradition, and I want to be very clear about the fact that I'm talking about the Anglophone tradition here. So there's many traditions of speculative fiction in many languages, and what I am arguing here is not applicable to any but the Anglophone tradition. Science fiction and fantasy are quite strongly influenced by the cultural inheritance of the classical Mediterranean, taken up and promulgated so very thoroughly through the Enlightenment. And one can read, and many have read, science fiction itself as the literature of the Enlightenment myth of progress, especially early science fiction, the quote-unquote golden age, which has a lot of clever, strapping scientist men exploring new worlds with new technology and meeting many, many alien babes. And in a sense, that is a version of the Enlightenment myth of progress. Technology will forever improve us. We are free of the constraints of religion, of superstition, and go off and explore new worlds and colonize them. It's great. And thus science fiction is full of Enlightenment ideas of classical empires, or at least the culturally received versions thereof. And often those empires are evil, especially because in opposition to them, there tend to be democracies. Evil empires full of decadent bureaucracy. And if you are a Byzantinist or hang out with Byzantinists, you'll know how often that particular set of phrasing, decadent bureaucracy, gets applied to Byzantium, not just in the 20th century or the 21st, but by Byzantium's contemporaries in the West, particularly Liutprand of Cremona. So evil empires and bureaucracy, and this is a sort of tension between the idea of Rome or classical Greece, the beating heart of classical culture as held up by the Enlightenment, and Enlightenment ideas about Byzantium, which is the fallen version of all of that. So there's this valorization of classical culture as being progressive and the bureaucratic evil empire being fundamentally decadent. And this shows up in science fiction as an echo, a reification after the fact of the Enlightenment attempt to reclaim or repurpose Greek heritage from those people who were actively using it, the live possessors, diaspora Byzantines living in Italy. Now, to return to science fiction for a moment, the most Roman of science fiction genres is probably the space empire, even if in its most far future trappings. And I have always felt that empire is something that is either taken for granted in space opera, uninterrogated, simply present as a fact of world building, or rendered so evil as to be incomprehensibly bad. For example, if you consider the recent Star Wars sequel trilogy, sequel trilogy, the last three ones, and the First Order, which is a evil empire of all evil empires. What exactly do they do for anyone? What benefit does their existence have for their citizens? It's hard to tell. And real empire, both Byzantine and later and earlier, is much nastier than either set dressing or pure, laughable, extreme evil. Empire is the kind of poison that gets into the groundwater of a culture, and it can be very, very pretty while it strangles it. And to talk about how this appears in science fiction, especially recent science fiction in the Anglophone tradition, so within the past 5-6 years, I actually want to talk about some work that isn't mine. The American author Anne Leckie's recent trilogy, the Imperial Raj Trilogy, which came out between 2013 and 2016. They're also called the Ancillary Books. And this trilogy was really well received. It won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards, and it received substantial international attention. And you could basically think of the Ancillary Books as part of the current thematic zeitgeist of Anglophone science fiction. And the Imperial Raj books are not specifically self-identified as Byzantine or post-Roman. I have spoken to their author, Anne Leckie, and we've had a lovely conversation about the fact that she knows absolutely nothing about Byzantium. So this is a kind of organic creation. The themes of her books can be really interestingly interpreted through a Byzantine lens. First, I need to briefly digress onto the Romanness of Byzantines and Byzantine conceptions of civilization and alienness, barbaroi versus Romao. And this opposition has really deep historical roots stretching back to Attic Greek conceptions of uncultured nomadic barbarians that exist in contrast to urban and educated Greeks. And barbarian came to be similarly contrasted with the civilized world of Roman imperial systems, and this contrast was maintained by Byzantine rhetorical culture. And when you have this sort of comparative self versus other construction, barbarian, citizen, Romaioi, barbaroi, it's often used to establish and maintain an internal sense of imperial identity. Being a subject of the Byzantine Empire, being a Romaiois, is associated with being a civilized human, a citizen of a world which is in accordance with cosmic order. And we find the word Romaioi pervasively all over Byzantine literature. It appears in all forms of documents aside from those that are strictly theological. It's employed by individuals from a wide variety of social and geographic origins throughout the entire 1,000-year span of Byzantium's existence as an independent polity. And it possessed a dual definition. It was both a political loyalty and a set of cultural criteria. And these cultural criteria included the practice of Chalcedonian Christianity, being a native speaker of Greek, and a general state of civilized behavior. And in the sense of political loyalty, Romaioi appears as clear shorthand for the political entity ruled by the emperor, and basically can be used in a replacement, a synecdoche for that entity. For example, the De Administrando Imperio, the Romaioi receive tribute, rule territory, and conduct diplomacy, which technically the emperor does these things, but there's a collective noun. And the Byzantines also referred to their empire as Romania, a geographical term which had connotations of extent of territory, but that usage is relatively rare in official documentation until the Komnenian period. Instead, imperial officials referred to the extent of Byzantine political power as the arche, the rule, or the hegemonia of the Romaioi. The empire was Roman. Thus, cultural behavior appropriate to a citizen of it was subsumed inside this Romanity, even if that cultural behavior happened to be Greek. For example, in the Chronicle of Theophanes, we have a story about the marriage alliance, proposed marriage alliance, between Charlemagne's daughter and the Empress Irene's son Constantine. And Theophanes writes that she, namely Irene, sent the eunuch and Dotarios Elisaios to teach her, being Charlemagne's daughter, about Greek literature and language and to educate her in the customs of the Imperium of the Romans. So the same thing is true. So here's the process of learning Greek, a language which the prospective bride of the emperor would require to function in her new home, and it's regarded as an essential part of being a subject of the Roman Imperium. And engaging in this cultural education allowed Byzantine Romans to employ their sense of their own continuity with ancient Rome as a justification for their universal empire and a method by which that universal empire is performed and enacted. So Byzantines are thus innately different from non-Byzantine persons. Participating in the culture defined by Byzantine imperial ideology means that first, one is not a barbarian, and second, that there's a specific set of behaviors and beliefs which make one a Byzantine and therefore subject to the empire. So we've got Romaioi, barbaroi, and there might be an uncomfortable third category of people who shift in between. And we can use those categories to productively read AnnaLinden's Imperial Raj Trilogy. And so I'll give a very brief summary here. The books are a first-person account of the protagonist Brek, who is an artificial intelligence who was once simultaneously a spaceship called Justice of Torin and a many-bodied ancillary army of slave soldiers, but now inhabits only one body, one of those ancillary bodies. And the story of the trilogy is her attempt to take revenge on the Lord of the Raj, the emperor of the empire which she once served, and who destroyed her other bodies and killed her most favored human officer. And during the course of the story, we spend time in 3 separate planetary or extraplanetary locations within and on the fringes of the empire known as the Raj. One is a planet recently conquered and not yet assimilated. One is not within the bounds of the empire at all. And one is a central hub at the heart of Rajai culture and dominion. And each are depicted not only with their own individual cultures and subcultures, but with strong internal variations and divisions. Seen through the eyes of a person, Brek, who belongs to the empire, but who can never be a citizen, no matter what sort of behavior she has, because she's an ancillary, and ancillaries are created from the bodies of conquered peoples. Moreover, Lecky engages in this ongoing thematic critique of the nature and purposes of empires, particularly expansionist ones with universalist ideologies like Byzantium, by drawing attention to and centering a very Byzantine model of civilization versus non-civilization possessed by her fictional imperium. And I'm going to quote you from the first volume of the trilogy now. Imagine your whole life aimed at conquest, at the spread of Rajai space. You see murder and destruction on an unimaginable scale, but they see the spread of civilization, of justice and propriety, of benefit for the universe. The death and destruction, these are unavoidable byproducts of this one supreme good. And that's the protagonist, Breck, speaking. Now, the universalist values of the Raj, Leki's fictional empire, are justice, propriety, and benefit, but those values are defined as being Rajai, and they are innate to all of the processes of the empire, no matter how destructive to the outside world, which are, after all, barbarians. Leki problematizes these values and, in fact, calls into question the universalism of her constructed empire, which does bear a strong resemblance to a late Roman or Byzantine empire in terms of its military structure, it having a strong center and a distant periphery, and its linguistic equation of Rajai with civilized in the mode of Romaile equaling civilized. And she problematizes these values by making her protagonist a person who begins life as a non-Rajai, Breck's body is a foreign body, becomes sort of a Rajai as an artificial intelligence made up of many bodies plus a ship, and then over the course of the trilogy negotiates the degree to which she is Rajai and thus imperial, an imperialist, or not. And Leki's trilogy is in many senses about the decolonization of an imperial mind, but an imperial mind in the Roman mode. So I spent a lot of time talking about someone else's work. And amusingly enough, I was writing a memory called Empire long before I ever read the ancillary books. So there's some convergent evolution going on here. But my own work is in this same vein, though it is perhaps more deliberately so because I am a Byzantinist. To read Space Empire in a Byzantine fashion for me is often more useful than reading it in a classical Roman or in a British imperial context. It gets at a deeper sort of conflict. And I've talked a bit about how the setup of the colonialist power in a memory called Empire, the Empire of Teixcalaanli, culturally and militarily threatens the independence of my protagonist's home called Lascelles Station. And part of that comes from basically trying to do the 11th century conflict between Byzantium and Armenia, except in space. And part of it comes from my own personal history. I'm an assimilated American Jew. And my immediate history is being a somewhat tolerated member of an imperialist power, not from being a culture which was colonized, but the questions of what if you find yourself loving what is poison to you, even though you know it is poison? I mean, I wrestle with this all the time. For example, I really love Wagner operas. I have paid a great deal of money to see an entire Ring cycle, and I will do this again when such things are possible. And yet I know intimately what Wagner believed about people like me and how interlaced those beliefs are into all of his work. And it's not the same thing as being from a colonized culture, of course, but it's where I first got caught on the idea. And then I studied an empire, Byzantium, that believed so profoundly that it was the mirror of heaven, the extant known universe, the only place where the world was true and right. And I, myself, found that empire beautiful. And I wanted to know why it was so easy to be seduced. So I wrote this book. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for this opening into your book. I mean, you mentioned a world in which wormhole travel becomes possible and connects worlds. And again, in a very peculiar and funny way, the Byzantine connection is there. If you think of Leo of Catania and of the baths, where you enter a bathhouse in Catania and you end up in Constantinople in another bathhouse. So endless fun dealing with that in a classroom with fellow students. So if I may ask a question, you cast we cast your talk as Byzantium and science fiction, and you compellingly presented how Byzantium fits into this story. Yet Teixcalaan is more complex than Byzantium. It's more diffuse. There is more to it. Even when I see how you do off Teixcalaan, so Teixcalaanli, it's almost like a Turkish kind of modification.
Yep.
So could you talk a bit more about other influences that are dovetailing with Byzantium to produce this world?
So there are probably three other big influences besides Byzantium that come into how I developed Teixcalaan. And the big one is the Aztecs, the Empire of the Mexica. And you can see that in some of the language. You can see that in some of the religious practices and in some of the general aesthetic that I tried to evoke. And it was important to me that I didn't want to do Byzantium in space. I didn't want it to be direct. I wanted to take everything that Byzantium made me think about and tell a story that wasn't dependent on Byzantium. And honestly, to do that, one of the big things I had to do was figure out how to build a universalizing empire that wasn't Christian, because that's so central to how Byzantines imagine their universalism. And for me, I was like, well, that's not what I want to do. I want to do something really far in the future that doesn't have any direct relation to any Earth culture specifically. So how can I unchristian this universalizing empire? And I went and I looked at the Aztec Empire, which is also a universalizing empire, a very, very strong one, and thought, all right, I can shift this. I can find ways of talking about being the center of the world that don't depend on a monotheistic God. And the other big influence is actually modern American empire, which is more in the sense of how does cultural imperialism work? When you find a McDonald's in Siberia, that is cultural imperialism on the highest level. The vast and inescapable extent of American cultural capital is something I kind of wanted to evoke in how Teixcalaanli literature and thought patterns and what's good or pretty or how one should live one's life has just been diffused all over the galaxy in this book. So that came out of being an American and sometimes being really disturbed by the fact that I was one.
Yeah, I mean, this is this to me was the fascinating element, and I'm really happy that you bring the American experience because if I may assume for a moment the subaltern kind of role as a Greek and think about how before ever having had any contact with your hometown, New York, I was nevertheless conversant with a lot of kind of the vocabulary, whether this is urban planning vocabulary or whether this is the general culture that emanates from this, from my little kind of equivalent of Armenia in Byzantium, far away from the imperial capital. And I'm thinking that what I find fascinating in your book, and you gave some explanations about how you do it by talking about the Armenian issue and about the Jewish identity, is this assumption of a subaltern position on the part of Mahit, and this very sensitive presentation of what it means for the subaltern to come in contact with that sort of dominant culture and start flirting with it and even adopt it. What other inspirations other than the ones that you've already mentioned, like the Armenian experience and the doctoral studies and the own personal sort of origins, helped you construct a character like Mahit, you think?
I have the great good fortune to have a friend from the Philippines she's an illustrator, Mia Sereno, who we've spent a lot of very productive conversations and very enjoyable conversations talking about what it means to not have access to your own history as a child. As the Philippines were colonized first by the Spanish and then by America. And so much of the pre-Spanish Filipino heritage is just almost completely inaccessible to modern Filipinos who are growing up there. And my friend Mia would talk to me about how, especially British literature and American literature, were what she grew up on, what formed her aesthetics, and the process of trying to, as an adult, understand why that had happened and what she might want to change and what she didn't want to change about it. And her experiences, while being different from mine, reminded me a great deal of some of the ways that growing up a New Yorker and a Jew in America can make one feel alienated from a culture that one is inextricably also a part of. I mean, in the thankfully just past administration, the idea of New York City as not being the real America goes on and on and on, and being Jewish in America is always a sort of contingent position. So I found echoes of my own experience and my friend's experience. And I also was very graciously given the opportunity to give drafts of my work to Mia and to other friends of mine who do come from subaltern cultures, because the last thing I wanted to do was to make egregious errors. And I really appreciate their help in that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Now, you mentioned both in your presentation in passing and also just right now, kind of in passing, the current political moment. And I think this gets me to this other question. While in many ways this book is about contact between empire and distant to-be possessions and their people, it is also about crisis of empire. I mean, there is a civil war that is about to unfold and is unfolding there. Sorry, I hope this is not a spoiler. In the current moment, this to me appeared quite resonant, but would you want to discuss the inspiration for that aspect of the novel, this internal crisis of empire, the robust imperial edifice that at the same time is not so robust, perhaps?
So the fascinating thing is that publishing is really slow. So I finished this book in, God, when exactly did I finish it? I finished it in the first draft in 2016 before the November election. And I finished the second draft in May of 2017. So publishing is quite slow. You sell a book and then you wait a year and a half for it to be published. So if I was talking about the sense of possible disintegration and destabilization of empire, I was doing it relatively subconsciously. I was much more consciously working off of, in this case, Byzantine models for ways that empire can go wrong. I'm fascinated by the good king problem. Like, autocracy is all well and good if you have someone who's brilliant and kind and moral in charge. In fact, it's probably the easiest way to run a place if you have someone who is brilliant and kind and moral in charge. But you really only get one of those in a row, even if you do it hereditarily, and it's hard to get even one. I can think of maybe 2 or 3 emperors in all of the history of humanity that I know about who might qualify, and I'm not sure. So I'm interested in that problem. I'm interested in the problem of what do people want to preserve about imperium, and is that linked tightly to an emperor, or is it linked to a system?
Now, the next one might be a bit tricky, not for any other reason other than I might be confused in asking it myself. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the imago machine, because I have a question on it, and maybe you can explain to our audience the premise, and then I can get on with the question.
So on Lascelles Station, which is my protagonist's home, which is in some ways modeled off of medieval Armenia, but not in that many ways, really. There is a technology which allows for the preservation of skills and memory cross-generationally. And this technology is called the imago machine. And basically you get the memories and skill sets of the person who used to have your job when you acquire that job. And then you get a chain of memory, and their longest chains are like 15 generations long. And of course, the older memories sort of subsume into a general sense of skill. So you really only have a strong sense of presence for maybe the last person or the last two people. Mm-hmm. But this came out of a completely different, much more science fictional question that has always interested in me, which is, how do you preserve institutional memory in a situation where people are probably going to die a lot, like a generation ship, where you're living with some metal between you and the vast void. And also there's a lot of cosmic radiation, so people are going to get all sorts of cancers and die young. And you don't have that many people because you can't support that many. How do you avoid losing skills? And I came up with this answer, and then I wanted to play with it. So Mahit has in her mind the imago of the last person who had her job, Iskander Agavan, who was the last ambassador to Teixcalaan. And at the beginning of the book, she thinks this is going to go all right, and then very rapidly she is without her expected ally, including much of his knowledge set, which produces a great deal of the plot. I'm trying to avoid spoilers. Does that help?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's a perfect introduction, and I'll just kind of throw at you the interpretation of the Byzantinist who turns the text into something that needs to be analyzed. To me, this is quite fascinating, because the imago machine appears like the technology that the subaltern has that the empire doesn't. So there is an advantage there. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it raises some interesting tensions with the empire, because the empire's cultural sort of preeminence and power seems to come through these texts, poetry, learned material that you would study almost as if you were going for a Confucian-style examination. And at the same time, the imago machine to me almost feels like an oral tradition, which in the case of Mahit also seems to be having some issues. And I wonder whether there is this kind of tension. I mean, that the imago almost represents a highly developed kind of oral tradition that comes to clash with the more established written code.
That's absolutely fascinating, because it's about 75% of what I was thinking, and 25% I've never thought about it before, but it's really good, which I love. This is one of the fun parts of writing fiction, is that people can spot things that you may have done without knowing you did them. So I always meant there to be a deep contrast between the textualized, learned, emulative behavior of how to be an educated Teixcalaanli and the Lascelles Station imago system, where you're basically picked for a job and a career based on your psychology and your physicality, and slotted into a hole and then made part of a long memory chain. And I always wanted to contrast those two different ways of thinking about one's own history and what the preservation thereof. I had never before just now made the connection to the oral tradition, and I love that. That's brilliant. I wish I'd known that I was doing that. I think it fits really well. And it is a much more oral tradition than anything that Teixcalaan does, because it's more direct, it's person to person.
Yep. So I have more questions, but I see audience coming in. Do you have the question box?
Oh,
I can start reading.
You go ahead.
I have from my colleague David Mirhadi. I can see parallels between what you're discussing and Star Wars with its failed republic. So why are the Star Trek universes so different? Or is Discovery's millennial leap and search for remnants of the Federation to be an attempt at emulating it?
Oh, the Star Trek versus Star Wars thing. So personally, I think that Star Trek and Star Wars are working off very, very different traditions. Star Wars comes from the epic tradition. Basically, it is a Bildungsroman, at least in its original format. It might as well be a fantasy novel, even though it is set in space. Sometimes I call it science fantasy. And it operates on a scale that can feel more like epic fantasy. A lot of space opera does. And I think that what I discussed in the talk at the beginning of the types of bureaucratic evil empire versus fallen republic is very much part of that tradition. What Star Trek is doing is something that comes much more out of the Cold War. And the Federation, which is hyper-democratic. It's like American democracy reified and made perfect in the mind of Gene Roddenberry, is contrasted with, at least in the original series, with the Klingon Empire, which I think is meant in some very direct ways to represent the warlike and foreign Russian, Eastern European forces. And then later on, when you get the Borg, that's an even more explicit call out to communism. So I think it's dealing with a different set of questions. So you get different forms of space government. And I'm afraid that I actually haven't watched Discovery, so I can't really speak to what it's doing. Someday I will do that, and then I'll tell you.
So, okay, so another question is from Hope Willard. Thank you so much for your talk. One of the things I found fascinating about your book was the presence, which seemed to be quite deliberate, of physical objects among the advanced technology of Teixcalaanli. I'm thinking particularly of Infofish sticks. Actually, that's great. Could you tell us about this? Thanks again.
Yeah, so that was immensely deliberate for several reasons. One, Teixcalaan is a society that is completely obsessed with its own history, much like Byzantium. And I think that using a technology which is unnecessary and old for aesthetic reasons is something that only an incredibly resource-rich place can do and would want to do. And that was one of the ways I wanted to convey how much resources Teixcalaan has is, well, they could just send everything by email, but why would they do that? It's not pretty, it's very functional. The other thing is I have a tendency to pull away from the Chrome and iMac vision of the future whenever possible. I don't really think that that's the ultimate way in which humans and technology will relate to each other. I think that we like touching things and that we like things that are beautiful and things that we can personalize. So when I was inventing cultures of the future, I wanted them to have some of those things. And for the Infofish specifically, one of the reasons I ended up picking that was that I was doing a little bit of tribute to an author and book I love. The author is Catherine Addison. The book is The Goblin Emperor, and there are several scenes in which people have to answer endless amounts of mail on physical pieces of paper, and I just kind of love that and wanted to do an echo. So that was why I ended up picking that first, and it evolved from there.
I mean, that's a question of beauty, of form, is so crucial. I mean, I'm thinking of a space that is not at all literary, simple car design. I mean, the Tesla screen on the middle of the car, as opposed to others sticking with the traditional mode because it might be more familiar to people. Mm-hmm. But I'm also thinking about ways in recent Netflix series on space. You see the representations of spaceships with way more buttons than you would expect given the current technology. I mean, we seem to be attracted to this idea that there will be a bit more of a physicality there.
I think, and I try not to make predictions because both historians and science fiction authors tend to be kind of bad at it because we see too many connections between things. But I think we're at the crest of the sort of touchless world at the moment. I think a lot of personalization is something that we'll see in the next 20 years, and shaping of both the digital world and the tactile world to be more connected to each other. I think the pandemic is pushing that faster, and I think things like the Oculus system with virtual reality are pushing that faster. People like to have more than just the visual experience.
So to take us away from objects for a moment and go back to words, names, and rhyme, Nikki and Andrew have two different questions that perhaps can be answered together. Although I have not read your novel, I have read about the Teixcalaanli names system on Tor.com. I may ask you to speak a bit about that and how you developed it. And if I can tag a follow-up on that, can you talk about the poetry in a memory called Empire, such a beautiful aspect of the novel?
So the names come from the system of naming from the Mixtec people of Mesoamerica, where you have things like one jaguar and like 10 eagle, number plus name, number noun system. And I wanted to do that to sort of pull away from anything that felt too familiar. And I then developed it further and set certain specific rules, which became part of the cultural aesthetic that I was trying to build for Teixcalaan. The part where all of the noun parts of their names are not animals and nothing that can move by itself, which I think I stole from a grammatical rule from Russian. Like the difference between animate and inanimate things with the accusative. So you can name a kid, I don't know, cabinet, like 3 cabinet if you like, but you certainly can't name a kid 3 self-driving car because it moves on its own. And I picked that and what kinds of nouns they used. They like flowers, they like objects, like very tool-oriented objects, and they like astronomy, to emphasize what sorts of cultural components the Teixcalaanli thought were beautiful, because I wanted that to be something that pervaded the book. And that's true of the poetry too, to go on to the second bit. I wanted to do, there's a scene in the center of the book, which I am still delighted I got away with, which is functionally a poetry battle between a bunch of, there's both a formal one and an informal one. There's a poetry contest at the Imperial Court, which is, again, something from Middle Period Byzantium. And there's a bunch of young, smart, ambitious people standing around basically challenging each other to a rap battle with poetry. And that is both based off of going to slam poetry nights and Middle Period Byzantium. And I wanted to use the very real and genuine power that poetic verse has in politics and still does today. Protest poetry, protest songs, the ways that poetry can elide a seditious or inappropriate sentiment by framing it in a way that you have to know what you're reading to understand, that kind of encoded knowledge. And I wanted to use that. And also I wanted to, again, focus the reader on the obsession with beauty and aesthetics that this culture has, which, and sometimes I say that I built Teixcalaan to seduce me. I kind of did. If, like, I built everything that would get me. I would love to go to one of those, like Mahit loved to go to one of those. And I wrote the poetry in the book myself, even though I would not consider myself a poet, which is why it's not in verse. Even though if Teixcalaanli was a real language, it would be in verse.
So going on from Iulia, thank you for your fascinating book and talk. I found the queerness of relationships very interesting in the novel, as well as the near adoration of the emperor's body. Could you discuss queer Byzantium in your novel a bit?
Oh, wow. You know, that's really interesting. The characters who are queer in the novel are queer because there are queer people in the world. One of the delights of this is that no publisher ever blinked. Like no one ever asked me to change anything. And that made me really happy because first of all, it would ruin the plot in several cases. And second of all, I myself am queer and I really wanted to write about people like me, but in a very unmarked way. Like there are people who are straight, there are people who are queer, and in Teixcalaanli no one cares. But the adoration of the body of the emperor, that is very much something that comes out. It's kind of a very queered, conceptual way of relating to a person. Did I make specific reference to queer Byzantium? Not really. It's never been a deep focus of my areas of study, except a little bit on eunuchs and some of the concepts of service which exist in the relationship of, say, 19 ads to the emperor and the emperor's other sworn bodyguards to the emperor come out of that idea of the perfect servant, which is the Byzantine eunuch, but made more complicated and less ideal because, of course, people are people.
So going on, Sergio has two questions. First is, do theater and dance, thespian disciplines play any role in your narrative world? Parentheses, thus they are apparently absent from the Byzantine universe of sources, though we can perhaps pause
We can object to that, but...
Yes, I would. And then in your academic production, example in your article, Ideological Story Worlds of Byzantium and Armenia, you speak of historiography and model selves. Do you really think we have any historiography at all before the 19th century? I mean, in worlds where historians are so busy in reshaping events in order to build reassuring, coherent world for their target audience, that historical events are interested in a larger fictional frame, inserted in a larger fictional frame?
Okay, those are complex questions. Hang on a moment. Let me figure out where to start there. Okay, so theater and dance. Leaving aside the fact that there is definitely theater and dance in Byzantium, and we could get into that. Yes, they are in the narrative world, but I did not focus on them. Mostly because they didn't seem like something that came up much in the plot. I didn't end up running into having Mahit or any of the other characters show up at a theater production or a dance production. There is quite a bit in the epigrams that begin each chapter of references to things that are basically television shows or teleplays, including some scripts from those. And there's a very rich theatrical tradition in Teixcalaanli, I'm sure there is. Anything that has gotten around to producing the soap opera has definitely had some less soap opera theater to start with. I should do more with dance. I haven't done much of anything. It's hard to write about dance. It's really hard to write about dance. Like, you think writing combat is hard. Dance is even harder because it has to be pretty and you have to sort of be able to see it. Anyway, so I talk about historiography and model selves in that article. Yes, I do. Do you think I have any historiography at all before the 19th century? Yes, obviously. I wouldn't have written that article if I didn't. I'd sort of like to flip your question around. Do you really think that in the 19th century, suddenly historians weren't trying to influence events and target their audiences? Because I think they are, and I think they still are today. As a historian, as someone who has written history and historiography, I always have an audience in mind, and I am always shaping a world. In this way, being a fiction author and being an academic author are exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I try to tell that to my students that I wrote a book on Ataliatis, and I feel that sometimes I'm becoming Ataliatis myself, trying to follow similar strategies. Moving on from David, thank you for the talk and an incredible novel. My question, as a historical scholar who has put much of your previous research into the narrative of your science fiction, did you ever find yourself having to navigate the tension between broadly stated, the historical and the fantastic? And do you have plans to take up aspects of your research in a science fiction context in the future?
So one of the get out of jail free cards of writing science fiction is that I don't have to be historically accurate. I'm terrified of writing real historical fiction. Absolutely terrified, because I know how much research it would require to make me satisfied. I have some, I throw this idea out to whoever is listening. I've done this before. So you know the problem of too many emperors in 3rd century Rome, where you get like a new one every 3 weeks and it just gets faster. And you have this difficulty with communicating with the edges of the empire. And if you've read science fiction, you know about the Ansible, which is faster than light communication, although not faster than light travel. Will someone please write a story in which 3rd century Rome invents the Ansible and what happens next? Because I want to read that, and I am terrified of writing it. I do not know enough, and I have spent a lot of time on the 3rd century, and I still don't know enough. But science fiction and fantasy, you can get away from that kind of strict, you have to know everything to make this work. You just have to be really internally consistent with your own choices. And I think that's deeply important. And for me, often when I criticize the work of other authors and write criticism about it, what I look for is, does this work in general, like things like this, have worked in history? So does this empire function like empires I can imagine being real? Do these characters respond to a particular situation in a way that makes sense with historical examples of that situation? There was a second half of the question. Oh, what will I use research in the future? Absolutely, of course I will. Everything that I learn about and every career I've had tends to influence what I do next. My current projects, 2 of them, one which is nearly finished, is a locked room architectural murder mystery, which came out of reading a whole lot of stuff about place and space when I was working in urban planning. And the other one is a novel called Prescribed Burn, which is near future science fiction, well, middle future science fiction, and is about water rights and electric grids and wildfires, which comes out of what I'm doing now. But the ways I understand empire ideology, historiography, and narrative creation are never going to disappear. They're never going to be without me. And I don't think Byzantium will ever be something that I'm not thinking about. So I expect it to show up in all sorts of places.
So, I mean, your reference to upcoming work and kind of closer near future projects gets me to a question I had myself. I think I have heard you or read you on an interview where you referred to Kim Stanley Robinson as an inspiration. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't think I have, actually, though there would be no reason I wouldn't. But not directly Kim Stanley Robinson, though. For Prescribed Burn, my more immediate antecedents are Max Gladstone, Two Serpents Rise, and Pablo Baglagucci's The Water Knife. But Kim Stanley Robinson, The Drowned New York, that's definitely also in the mix, you know.
More of my question in a way by bringing him in is, I've been reading him recently. I'm not a huge science fiction buff, but he's been a great world to inhabit for a while. But I'm thinking that his worlds are basically much closer to ours than Teixcalaan. I mean, it's 300 years in the future, perhaps, or even more proximate. What are the narrative advantages for going for the bigger space opera, kind of the culture of Ian Banks or something, scale of reality, as opposed to the near future for you? And why was that chosen as opposed to a closer to home reality?
The advantages are huge. You don't have to figure out how you got there from here. Just you assume that at some point you did, which means you can get a lot closer to the questions you actually want to ask. Like the questions I wanted to ask were about empire and assimilation. And I wanted to get as sharp and unpleasant as I could, but not have it be something that would hurt anyone real. So I didn't want, it's not my place to write from a subaltern culture that exists. But if I go out into the future and invent a subaltern culture, that's where I can read my own experiences and the experiences that I know about and create something that, so you want that edge of the knife that is sharp enough to hurt, but not sharp enough to make you bleed. That's the merit of going really far future. I think with Prescribed Burn, I'm challenging myself actually as a writer to work a little closer to where we are, to rely a little more on chains of logic that get from 2020 to Prescribed Burn is set in 2041, not 2041, 2441. So about 400 years in the future.
So going to Rosanna, I loved your book and found Iskandar a very tragic figure. To what extent did you intend him as someone the reader, especially the reader who might be in a position to be experiencing cultural colonialism in the present day, might identify strongly with?
Enormously. I identify with him myself sometimes. I find him both tragic and sympathetic, and also really difficult. He's not an easy person. He's not an easy person to write, and he's not an easy person, I think, to live with the other fictional people. But that character is a character I love. The version of someone who decided to give in some ways, and what did that do to him, and what did he keep, and what did he think he was keeping?
So James notes, my book club argued at length about the sunlit. We could not figure out what they represented and how human they are. Would you shine some more light on the sunlit?
I'm afraid for plot reasons, I can't do that. I will say that they are human, or at least they definitely started out that way.
Okay.
And that in terms of what they represent, they came a little bit out of the sort of Praetorian Guard, and then just I expanded that enormously in all directions. So it's not a direct reference, but obviously the emperor should have like his own police force.
Andrew asks, saying first, thank you for this talk. You mentioned Wagner and the Ring Cycle. Does that music or other music have bearing / influence on your writing?
Wagner, not specifically, though perhaps on just the sheer epic scale. But both my parents are classical musicians. I grew up listening to, playing classical music. I still sing, though not during the pandemic. And so music is enormously important to me as a person. And one of the things that really frustrated me about writing this book was that it never managed to acquire a soundtrack. I kept trying, but it just doesn't have one, mostly because I think I don't know what Teixcalaanli music sounds like. So it's hard to find what that is. But I am definitely someone who loves choral work, opera, chamber music, indie rock. Almost all music is great. So yeah.
So from Alexandra, not really a question, rather a remark. I loved how in your novel you defined empire as this heavy mass pulling at the fabric of space, sort of a gravity center, and at the same time the center of attraction. It feels very accurate, and parenthesis speaking as both a classicist specializing in Hellenistic Jewish culture and a Polish reader with all the geopolitical ramifications of living in Eastern Europe seems a perfect metaphor.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
No, just thank you. That is what I wanted it to feel like. And so I'm really glad it worked.
And Lucas, thank you for the talk, Arkady. Early on, talking about the recent Star Wars sequels, you briefly hinted that there must be good aspects quotation marks, to empire. Otherwise, empires would not keep popping up. But then you pulled back on that very quickly. Could you say more? Lately, with all the centrifugal forces that seem to be pulling our civilization apart, it started to seem to me that a strong cultural centralism, shared narrative and values, etc., might be the price we have to pay when the alternatives are either strong central political authority or civil war.
So the argument I'm trying to make there, when I say that an empire can't just be sort of laughably evil, is that while such things exist, they tend to exist for short periods of time. They do not last. And even the ones that are truly horrific, like the Nazis, provided some sort of psychological, physical, or group feeling benefit to those who participated, or at least those who participated enthusiastically. Without that sense of how an empire could make people want to be part of it, even if those reasons are horrific, based in bias and hatred and fear, I don't find it realistic. And one of my problems with the First Order in Star Wars, and I love Star Wars, like I will be completely unashamed about that. I absolutely love Star Wars. But my biggest problem with the most recent trilogy was that the villains are not good enough villains. I don't know how they could have amassed the power they amassed. It doesn't make any sense. They don't offer anything to anyone. And this is different than the empire in the original trilogy, which quite clearly does seem to be offering cultural safety, meritocratic or at least semi-meritocratic advancement in the military, and wide-ranging travel opportunities to people. So that seems much more functional, much more realistic. To briefly address the second part of your question, what are we going to have to give up if we don't want to live in fascism, which is how I'm interpreting that question. Empire and fascism are very, very tightly linked. And the quote unquote best empires have a kind of multicultural center to them where there are lots of different ways of being an Ottoman, being a Byzantine, but you have to suborn all that to the overall ideology. And maybe fragmentation is the way to go. I don't purport to know what is best culturally for the largest majority of humans, but humans tend to gravitate towards centralizing narratives. And we've seen that for as long as we've had recorded history. So I certainly don't expect them to go away.
Continuing on the empire sort of theme, by using Byzantium and Mesoamerica as some of your inspirations for a futuristic imperial culture, you build it fundamentally on non-Western quotation or non-quotation marks paradigms. Was this a conscious choice?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I am tired of reading about the Roman Empire in space, and I'm tired of reading about foundation, like the sort of the ultimate version of Western science. Like, no, for fuck's sake. I wanted to do something that was new and interesting and appealing to me. And I also wanted to do something that felt a little bit like I could carve out some new space for the kinds of questions I wanted to ask. So that's why I gravitated in that way. And just because I've spent more than half my life with Byzantium, which is not really Western by most definitions. It's not where I landed. Like when I reach for empire, I reach for Byzantium. That's the immediate echo.
So moving to a question by a Byzantinist, I can only echo the praises and thanks by everybody for the talk and the book. During the introduction, you mentioned that you engage and comment primarily on Anglo sci-fi tradition when it comes to empire as a concept. What is your take on how some other sci-fi traditions address the issues of imperial legacy? Cixin Liu's trilogy comes to mind with its terrestrial vis-a-vis the space fleet state.
Yeah, so there's really fascinating work being done in the, particularly in the Chinese science fiction tradition, which interrogates ideas of empire or doesn't interrogate them, depending on what point of view you're looking at, from a completely different perspective than what I've talked about. And one of the reasons that I'm so careful to limit myself to sounding authoritative on the Anglophone science fiction tradition is that I don't read Chinese. I don't read Chinese. I don't read Urdu. There's an amazing Pakistani science fiction tradition right now going on. And I don't have direct access to it. I love when these things get translated into English, but that is filtered through a translator. And that translator may have different sets of biases and opinions. And it's hard to get a sense of the conversation when you only have what gets translated into English. But I do think that science fiction, which comes from a non-Anglophone tradition, from a non-Anglophone imperial tradition, deals with these questions in different ways and comes up with different answers and has different preoccupations. And someday I hope to work with some of the writers working in Chinese science fiction now and talk about these things with them if we can figure out how best to talk to each other and what language.
To ask a curiosity technical question, you said that you have an interest in the prettiness of objects and in their materiality. And I have to say that the book actually looks really good. I mean, this is a really good cover. And
I got very lucky.
And I have a question on that. I mean, did you have any input on the almost steampunkiness feel of the cover?
So authors have very little input on covers. Usually we get two kinds of input. The one where the editor or the art director comes to us and says, well, these are our ideas, which one do you like? Which is really code for which one do you hate least? And sometimes if you absolutely despise what ended up happening or you find something about it to be deeply problematic, you can say no, or you have to change that. My wife ended up having to do that on one of the covers of her books, where there was just sort of random Egyptian hieroglyphics that didn't mean anything. And it's like, this book is set in Egypt. This is not okay. If you want hieroglyphics, they have to be real words. So that kind of thing. But I had a discussion with my editor and the art director at Tor where they expressed to me that they wanted it to feel science fiction-y, but not like be the traditional spaceship and like space battle cover. So it could signal some of the differences between this and some more traditional science fiction. And I was all for that. I liked that. And I think the only thing that I asked very sharply about was that it not be silver dominant in color, but instead be gold dominant in color, because that matched the aesthetic of Teixcalaan. And there's this unwritten rule that fantasy books get gold covers and science fiction books get silver covers, because that's how they read on shelves. But I'm glad I won that one. And then I didn't see anything until they'd selected a cover artist and he had drafts, roughs for me to look at. And I was so happy with what I first saw, just having that visual of the throne, the Sunspear throne. And Jamie Jones is an incredible illustrator. The cover of the second book is equally great. So I'm really happy about it.
Speaking of second book, are we talking about the, Burn? Forget the...
No, this is the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, which will come out in March. So, my God, like 5 months now. It is called A Desolation Called Peace, which is a quote from Tacitus. It is it's a direct sequel, so it's about what happens to Mahit afterward. But it's also sort of my take on military science fiction and battles with incomprehensible aliens and whether you can actually ever communicate with anyone. So I'm really looking forward to having it out in the world.
So, and that actually leads me to the question, which would be in putting phonetics about names and a glossary at the very end with and dramatis personae almost. It appeared as if you were setting the groundwork for some sort of world building that goes beyond the book. And if I think of, let's say, Tolkien, when we talk about world building, you have from music to languages to maps and so on and so forth. Have you ever thought, especially as an urban planner, of trying to chart the city itself?
Because I tried once.
Yeah.
It didn't go very well. So the real problem is I probably should have tried to do it in GIS, Geographic Information Systems. I should have tried to do it digitally. I can't draw. I can't draw at all. I'm really bad at it. And drawing a multi-ringed, three-dimensional train system that covers most of a continent is a bit difficult when you can't draw. So I've also thought recently about drawing a sort of weird map of the universe, which is not a direct map because the way the jump gates work is you just have like pinpoint connections between places and they're not actually next to each other. Mm-hmm. So it would end up being not very readable. But I built the pronunciation guide because I'd spent so much time building the language and I wanted to show off, which is sort of selfish, but true. And the dramatis personae glossary was something that my editor asked me for, and I think was a very good idea. And I am currently putting one together for the second book.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I mean, navigating the city for me was perhaps the one moment where I needed to exercise more and more of my imagination. I felt that in your world building, I did not need to do a lot of work myself to follow it because it felt, okay, this works. The city itself in its scale and then in its walls that attack you and envelop you and do things. Yeah. Oh, that would be a real challenge for a director on a Netflix.
Yeah, it would. I guess you could do it with CGI. Mm-hmm. But no, figuring out, I know where things are in connection to other things, but I've never mapped out the whole system. Yeah. It's too big. And I guess in a way, I'm one of those people who world build with what I need as opposed to everything. Mm-hmm. I tend to dig pretty deep when I need something. In book 2, this is not a spoiler, but I needed people to be drinking beer on a generation ship. So I had to do a lot of research on how you could make beer if you can't grow wheat, because you can't really grow wheat on a generation ship that well. So we came up with kelp beer, but like I spent a week learning how to brew beer with weird things. But if I had not needed that scene, I would never have bothered. I only tend to go that deep on things that are either plot significant or atmosphere significant.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't have more questions from our audience for now. I'm really thrilled that we were able to have this conversation with our audience and personally after quite a while. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to the next installment. It's going to be a wonderful escape from Zoom land when it comes.
For you and me both.
And I have to say that I will do the best I can so that in the post-COVID reality, we could find a way to to have you in Vancouver and maybe do something interesting, say in the planetarium or something.
Yeah, I would absolutely love that.
Thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Being so engaging with us. Thank you. Now, I want to thank all of you for attending this event, for basically making this difficult time a very rich time for communicating through the seminar series. We need to remind ourselves that while on campus we would have had 15, maybe 30 people, we're doubling these numbers by simply being on Zoom, and this is perhaps the consolation that we can draw from this tricky time. We will renew our sort of meeting appointment for the coming weeks, and we will be sending more information with coming events. Once again, thank you so much on behalf of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies for being with us. Thank you, AnnaLinden, for being with us.
Thank you.